over 200 texts. None of them use the name Israel.
Welcome to Kedem. We are sitting now in Israel. We are both Jews and we are both Israelis. In the history, which identity, name came first?
In biblical scholarship and in archaeology, first we have ancient Israel, and then we have the Jewish identity, right? And this goes back all the way to the Bible. So if you look in the Bible, we have Jacob. The identity of Israel starts with Jacob. So Jacob, according to the biblical story, meets this divine figure at the Jabbok River, and he wrestles with him, and the divine figure gives him the name Israel. Jacob then goes on to have 12, the 12 tribes, one of whom is called Judah. And as we go on through, we're beginning, of course, with Genesis. As we go on throughout the Hebrew Bible, we continually meet this group called the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. And Judah is one of the tribes of the children of Israel. So, we go down to Egypt and you have the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 sons of Israel that go down to Egypt. Leaving Egypt, you have the 12 tribes that leave Egypt. And Judah is just one of those tribes. As we go on through the Hebrew Bible, we continue to find the children of Israel being this larger group and Judah being the smaller group within this larger group. We come to the time of David and Solomon, who are the kings of Israel. Although David and Solomon both come from the tribe of Judah, so they are, Judahites, they are also Israelites, and they are the kings of a larger corporate entity called Israel. After Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam, in his days, the kingdom splits. So you have a northern kingdom, which takes on the name of Israel, and the southern kingdom, which takes on the name of Judah. And from then on, for the next 200 years, we have a kingdom of Israel in the north and a kingdom of Judah in the south. The kingdom of Israel goes into exile, is conquered by the Assyrians late in the 8th century BCE. And then we continue on only with Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel essentially disappears. And all we have left is the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, because the southern kingdom of Judah used to be part of this larger entity of Israel, it never lost this larger identity of Israel, according to the biblical text. So the people in the south are also Israel. They are both Judah and Israel. And as we continue through the biblical story, we have the Babylonian conquest. The Babylonians come destroy Jerusalem in 586 BCE, and that puts an end to the kingdom of Judah. But the people of Judah, at least some of them are taken into exile into Babylonia. And we start to see this new term in the biblical texts, Jews. So in Hebrew, Yehudim, in Aramaic, Yehudaye. This is a term which appears late in the biblical text. So again, to recap, we have the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel first, and then this new identity of Jews, Yehudim, Yehudaye in Aramaic, which appears very late in the biblical text. This idea, this biblical idea, has been adopted, I would say, from the 19th century into the 20th century by scholars who essentially took this biblical idea and adopted it for scientific, historical, archaeological research. And they started to speak of the term ancient Israel, ancient Israelites, ancient Israelite religion, ancient Israelite settlements, ancient Israelite culture, and so on and so forth. And when they use this term ancient Israel, they're referring to both the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. Before there were a northern kingdom or southern kingdom, they speak of the ancient Israelites in the Iron One period. And this idea is completely based on the biblical idea that you have Israel first and then the identity of Jews coming out later. More recent years, scholars have begun to question this idea. First of all, scholars came to question whether there was biblical stories in general, right? So there was a question of were the patriarchs historical figures or not? And already, I would say starting in the 70s, we already have scholarship that's starting to recognize that these are not historical figures. This is not an historical period. These are stories rather than history. Later on in scholarship in the coming decades, scholars started to question other parts of the biblical story. So we have the question of whether there was a conquest under Joshua that came into question, whether there was a united monarchy under David and Solomon, where David and Solomon historical figures came into question. And once scholars started to question these narratives, these biblical narratives, the very identity of Israel came into question, because if we don't have any united group of any sort coming into the land, if we don't have a united group that are all descended from a single Jacob/Israel, if we don't have a united group that came into the land and conquered the land under Joshua, if we don't have a united nation that's ruled by a single king, Saul, David, Solomon, then perhaps this later supposed split between Israel and Judah wasn't actually a split. Perhaps it started off that way. And perhaps Israel always referred to this northern area, people living in this northern area, and Judah always referred to these people living in the southern area. And then scholars started to suggest that perhaps what ended up happening was that biblical writers, biblical authors that authored our biblical books came up with this idea that of this larger, greater Israel that encompassed both Judah and Israel as a kind of founding myth, and that it's actually a late idea, which probably postdates the Assyrian conquest of the kingdom of Israel. And it was only at a relatively late date that the biblical authors came up with this idea and started to propagate this idea as a kind of national propaganda of sorts. Okay, so this is scholarship from, let's say, the 90s. So we're going back, what is it now, 30 something years, that scholars have been developing these ideas. I am coming on the backs of this scholarship, and I am asking a question from the data. So the question that I'm asking is, when do we start to see, not the biblical texts, that's less of interest for me. I'm interested in the question, when do the ordinary people, so the farmers, the homemakers, the artisans that you would find in the marketplace, when do they adopt the name Israel? When do Jews adopt the name Israel as an identity? And the way I do that is by looking at non-literary texts. Okay, so what do I mean by non-literary texts? Non-literary texts are any kind of artifact that has writing on it. So that could be coins, that could be inscriptions on stone, that could be inscriptions on cuneiform tablets, that could be papyri, it could be mosaic floors, anything that has text on it, which is ancient, which is associated in some way with Jews. And this gives me a window onto the ordinary people, right? Because these aren't literary texts; these are ordinary daily things that ordinary people would come into contact, either produce themselves on a day-to-day basis, documents that ordinary people would produce, and or items that ordinary people would come into contact with. So coins, right? Everyone has coins in their pockets, right? Even the poorest person is going to have a small coin, which has an inscription on it. Mosaic floors in a synagogue, right? Ordinary people come to the synagogue and they see what's written on the floor. So these are things which ordinary people come into day-to-day contact with, and that gives us a much better window onto what they know about, what they're thinking, what they're doing, rather than the literary texts, which we always have the question, do the ordinary people know what's written in these literary texts? Are they interacting with them? You know, does this reflect the ordinary people at all? So what I do in this study is I start with the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE and move forward for the next approximately 1,000 years. So I'm looking at the entire period from the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era until the Muslim conquest of the Middle East, and we can give a date of 640 of the Common Era. So we're talking about over 1,000 years. And during this period of time, we have literally thousands of these texts, these inscriptional texts, non-literary texts, from throughout the ancient world, where there were Jewish communities, throughout the Mediterranean, Babylonia, Persia, this entire region. We have thousands of texts that are in some way associated with Jews. And what I'm looking for in these texts is, how do Jews self-identify? What name do they use for themselves? Do they call themselves Jews? Do they call themselves Israel? Do they call themselves Hebrews? Those are the options. And to see what name do they use for themselves, in what context do they use these names, and how this changes over time and over geographical areas. So that's the question, and that's the method. Now, you probably want to know what the results are.
That's why we are here for, Professor.
We'll start with the end. I'll tell you what the conclusions are, and then I'll unwrap that. So the conclusions are that the name Israel, the earliest appearance of the name Israel in this inscriptional record, we can actually date really, really well to within half a year, which is pretty incredible, because it appears on a coin. It appears on, actually, this coin. So this is a coin from the Great Revolt of the Jews against the Romans, and it's dated to the first year of the revolt. The revolt broke out in the autumn of 66 of the Common Era, and that year ended in the spring, so around March, April of 67. So we're about half a year that we know exactly. The end of 66, the beginning of 67. And on this coin, it has the words Shekel Yisrael, the shekel of Israel. This is the first inscriptional text, the first inscription that we have from antiquity, which was made by Jews and which has the name Israel on it. Okay, so this is relatively late. Okay, this is, we're going over 600 years after the Babylonian destruction. We're now right before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. So we're approximately 600 years, a little over 600 years after the Babylonian. During this entire time, we have hundreds of inscriptions which mention the name Jews, hundreds. None of them have the name Israel. So that's a pretty late appearance of the name Israel in the inscriptional record. After this coin appears, we have the name Israel appears not that often. It appears. It makes several appearances on Bar Kokhba coins from the Second Revolt of 132 to 135 CE. And then we have it on gravestones and synagogue floors and other inscriptions where the name Israel appears. But when it does appear, it almost always appears in what I like to call biblicizing language, either actual quotes from the Hebrew Bible, or else biblicizing language like this Shekel Yisrael, which seems to be alluding to the shekel, the half shekel tax that we find in the book of Exodus, where every Israelite is to give a shekel tax. And we have the term Israel, the children of Israel, and the shekel appear together in Exodus. So this is interesting, right? Whenever it appears, or almost whenever it appears in some kind of like I said, biblicizing language, either biblical quotes, biblical allusions, or biblicized language. And what I would, so then the question is, what's happening here? Why is it that the term doesn't appear at all until quite late? And then when it does appear, it appears in this biblicized language. And what I would suggest is that this is probably not the first time that Jews used the name Israel. It's the first attested, but it probably begins a little bit earlier. And what I would suggest, this is my bottom line, is that to me, it seems likely that it began when the Jews adopted the Hebrew Bible, or Hebrew, biblical texts as their sacred scripture in some way or another. And from my previous research, which I've discussed with you in the past, I think this happens in the Hasmonean period. So in our previous discussions, we discussed my 2 books, The Origins of Judaism, where I looked to see when Jews begin to keep the laws of the Torah. And there, the earliest evidence for that is in the Hasmonean period, the middle of the 2nd century BCE. I think that it makes sense that not only was it the Torah observance that begins then, but also the identity of Israel probably begins with the Hasmoneans as well, and for the same reason, right? The reason that people start to keep the Torah is because they come to know about the Torah. They adopted the Torah as their guiding, their guiding rule book. Together with that also comes the identity of Israel. It's an identity that was invented by the biblical authors, but that doesn't mean that it was adopted right away. It was adopted eventually, and I think what would make the most sense is that it was adopted in the time of the Hasmoneans. That seems to be where all the evidence is pointing to.
Professor Adler, could you please take me and walk me through this time and show me the evidence? Okay. Maybe we go back to Babylonian times.
Sure. Okay, so I made some big claims here. Really, I owe you to walk you through the evidence, take you by the hand, and go through the evidence. So let's begin with the Babylonian conquest, 586 before the Common Era. So from that period of time, from around this period of time, we actually have over 200 texts from the area of Babylonia. Right? We have texts which either refer to Jews, Judeans, Jews, or were written by them, or refer to them from an area called Al Yahudu. Al Yahudu, what does that sound like to you?
Yehuda.
Right, Yehuda. It sounds because what it actually is referring to is Judahtown. That's actually what it means. All of these texts refer to Judeans, but the way we're able to identify them is by their names. So they have Yahwistic names. That helps us to identify them as Judeans. But several of the texts also use the term Judeans, refer to Judeans specifically. Like I said, over 200 texts. None of them use the name Israel. It doesn't appear in any text. I should actually preface this, if we should take a 586 and mention, this isn't part of the study, but it deserves mentioning, that prior to 586, prior to the Babylonian destruction, we have a handful, literally, I can count on 2 hands, the amount of texts that refer to Israel and Judah. And when we look at those texts, we do have texts which refer to Israel, but these are all referring to the northern kingdom of Israel. None of them include Judah, none of them refer to Judah, none of them refer to Jerusalem as being part of Israel. All of the texts, and really we're talking about very, very, very small number. So just for example, we have the Mesha Stele, the Tel Dan Stele, we have some Assyrian texts which refer to Israel. We're talking about a very, very small number. All of them are referring to the northern kingdom. We also have texts which refer to Jews, are obviously referring to the southern kingdom. So even before 586, there are no texts which use the name Israel in reference to the southern kingdom. Zero.
And there is no common name like Judah and Israel together. Israel.
There's no common name that covers both Judah and Israel before 586. Also after 586, returning to Babylonia, the Al-Yahudu documents use only the name Judah. They never use the name Israel. The first time we find the name Israel in Babylonia, in this entire region, is from late antiquity. So from the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, we have these magical bowls, which are actually our earliest, jumping forward from the Al-Yahudu, it's the earliest archaeological evidence that we have associated with Jews. There were Jews living in Babylonia, there's no doubt about that. We don't have any archaeological evidence for them, unfortunately. These are the earliest archaeological finds, epigraphic finds that we have of Jews living in Babylonia, and they date to, like I said, late antiquity. And here we do find the name Israel. Usually the name is Jews. We do find the name Israel appearing here and there. But like I said in the beginning, it's always either quoting biblical verses or else alluding to biblical verses using, like I said, biblicized language. So for example, there are, and these are, all, by the way, all magical texts. So, they're kind of strange. But they'll make a demon swear various things and really weird stuff. But for example, they'll refer to a divorce, Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, which means according to the law of Moses and Israel. So here again, we're having an allusion to the Torah of Moses, the Torah of Israel. So there's this biblical allusion. And then we have, flat out biblical verses that are being quoted. So that's what we find. We don't find any individuals or communities that are identifying as Israel. I am an Israelite.
Someone identifies them as Israel.
So we don't have anyone identifying either as an individual or as a community as being Israel. We have these more abstract references to this corporate identity of Israel. And like I said, it's always in either biblical quotes or biblicized language. Okay, so that's Babylonian. We can move on to other regions. So let's take Egypt, where we have many documents.
What time we are talking about?
So, okay, let's begin with the earliest period that we have archaeological epigraphic evidence from Egypt, of Jews living in Egypt, which is the Persian period, the 5th century before the Common Era. Here we have documents. I'm sure you know which documents I'm talking about from Persian period Egypt.
You mean the Elephantine?
Exactly, Elephantine. So in Elephantine, we have many documents, dozens of documents, which are associated with Jews. And these all refer to Jews. When they use a term of identification, they use the term Jew. The Jews of Elephantine are called Yehudaye. That's the term that's used again and again. And individual Jews identify as Jews. The community is identified as a Jewish, Judean community. The term Israel appears 0 times in the entire corpus. So, okay, we're talking about dozens of documents. 0 speak of Israel. From Egypt, we have documents that post-date Elephantine. So going into the early Hellenistic period, again, we have many documents that are associated with Jews, which use the term Jew. These documents, they start off in Aramaic. They afterwards, after we get into the 2nd century for sure, already in the 3rd century BC, and certainly into the 2nd century and onwards, they become Greek, and the name used is Udaioi, which is the Greek name for Jews. And that appears again and again and again, dozens and dozens of times. We have the name Jews, the identity Jews, in these documents. The name Israel appears 0 times. And moving into the Roman period, the late Hellenistic period, the Roman period, we continue to find there are hundreds of papyri which refer to Jews. It's only very, very late that we find in one papyrus, it's a ketubah, a marriage document from Egypt, which uses the term Israel. And again, it's in the kind of context that I mentioned before in Babylonia of Kedat Moshe Yisrael. So again, we're talking about biblicizing language rather than any individual or community identifying as Israel. And this is only one papyrus. Of all the hundreds and hundreds of papyri from Egypt, which refer to Jews, there's only one where the name Israel appears. From Egypt, we also have inscriptions on stone. We have on ostraca, on pottery with ink inscription. And the name Israel appears on one inscription. The name the identity Jews appears on both the ostraca and on inscriptions on stone. The name Israel appears once in it's inscribed on a lintel, which probably belonged to a synagogue, and it's a fragmentary inscription, so we don't have the inscription completely preserved, but we can guess that it probably is part of a biblical phrase, Shalom al Yisrael, or that's I think a good guess of what the original inscription was. And again, Shalom al Yisrael, peace upon Israel, is a direct quotation from 2 verses in Psalms, where we have this phrase, peace upon Israel. That's the only inscription on stone from Egypt which has the name Israel. So again, we're looking at Egypt from the Persian period, from the 5th century before the Common Era, until the Muslim conquest. We're covering 1,000 years. And in this entire time, we have hundreds and hundreds of documents with hundreds of times that the identity Jews appears. Israel, twice, in only 2 of these documents. And again, in biblicized language. That's the evidence from Egypt.
If we are looking outside Egypt.
Okay, so we have the entire Mediterranean basin where there are Jewish communities. But by the time we get to late antiquity, the entire Mediterranean basin has Jewish communities dotting the lands surrounding the Mediterranean. And we have evidence from all of these communities. There, we don't have papyri. Papyri we find only in arid places like Egypt or the Judean desert. We'll get to Judea. That we'll leave for last. But when we look around the Mediterranean, we find inscriptions on stone. We find gravestones. We find mosaics, and we find on amulets. We find on all kinds of hard materials. And again, the story is the same story. We have hundreds of these texts. Many of them have the identity Israel. We have individuals identifying as Jews. Excuse me, if I said Israel, Jews. We have people identifying as individuals identifying as Jews. We have communities identifying as Jewish communities, both in mostly Greek texts, some Latin texts as well. Very few, all of them are late. All of them date to late antiquity. And again, the same phenomenon that we found in Babylonia and in Egypt, when the term Israel does appear, almost without exception, it appears in this biblicized language, quoting biblical verses, alluding to biblical verses. Oh, so again, for example, we have again the Shalom al Yisrael, peace upon Israel, which is direct biblical quote. There's only one inscription where an individual identifies as an Israelite. This is a tombstone of I believe, a 3-year-old girl from Rome, where she identifies as a Jewess and as an Israelite. This is the only inscription from the entire Mediterranean world where an individual, or for that matter, a community, identifies using the name Israel. Okay, so this is outstanding that we have only one inscription of this sort out of thousands of texts which refer to Jews. So this is the greater Mediterranean area. So we've discussed Babylonia, Egypt, and the larger Mediterranean world. What are we left with?
I think we miss the most important, the Judea itself.
So Judea itself. So Judea itself, or let's talk about the southern Levant, because Judea might refer to a very small area around Jerusalem. Let's talk about the southern Levant in general. Now, in the southern Levant, so first of all, it's important to note that in the southern Levant, historically, Jews generally lived in areas which were majority Jewish. So that means that if you were living in Judea, if you were living in Galilee, if you were living in Perea and the Transjordan, and you were a Jew, chances are that all of the people around you, or almost all of the people around you, were also Jews. Now, why is that important? And this is different than in the diaspora, because in the diaspora, Jews were living amongst non-Jews. In the southern Levant, that wasn't the case. Why is this important? Well, this is important because if a person is living amongst people of the same ethnic group, chances are that in the inscriptions, the ethnic identity won't come up very often. Right? If we're living in a Jewish community, as you and I both are, it doesn't come up that often, our identity as Jews. It's something which would come up more often if we're living amongst non-Jews. So numerically, there are far less attestations of any kind of identity, name being used with reference to Jews in the southern Levant. It's a little bit ironic. Right?
You don't need to.
You don't need to, right? It's like the joke about the fish that meets the other fish early in the morning and says, how is the water? And the other fish says, what's water? So you're living in a Jewish environment. There's no need to be identifying as, it's obvious that you're Jewish. So numerically, we find much less words being used, names, identifiers being used in the southern Levant. So that needs to be said. Having said that, again, when we find inscriptions from the southern Levant, beginning with the Babylonian period, the Persian period, and onward, we do not find the name Israel, as I said, until this coin. Okay, the coin from the Great Revolt. So, for example, we have other coins, and coins are great because I love coins. They give us a ton of information about the ancient past. This is a coin from the Hasmonean period. So the earliest Hasmonean coins are from John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus I. This dates to the 120s, 110s, before the Common Era.
And we deal with a lot of coins.
And on this coin, it says Yochanan HaKohen HaGadol, so John, the high priest, Rosh Chever HaYehudim, the head of the assembly of the Jews, the Judeans. So this is a coin which mentions Jews. It doesn't use the name Israel. And we have other archaeological artifacts which refer to Jews. For example, we have storage jars, amphora from Masada, King Herod the Great's palaces at Masada, which refer to Herod the Jew, Herod the Judean. Right? We have other inscriptions which refer to Jews. The name Israel doesn't appear until the Great Revolt coin. Once we have the name Israel appearing. We later have it on other coins. This will be the last coin that I'll show you. This is a coin from the time of the second revolt, from Bar Kokhba. And this coin uses the term Lecherut Yisrael, for the freedom of Israel.
This is very nice, very famous coin. Yes.
So this is one kind of Bar Kokhba coin from the second revolt, but there are other Bar Kokhba coins which refer to Shimon. So Shimon, Simon, who Bar Kokhba, Nisi Yisrael, which means, it's often translated as the Prince of Israel. And so again, the term Israel, we have Legeulat Yisrael. These are all, I would argue, a biblicized language. The idea of the redemption of Israel, the Prince of Israel. This is a term which we find in the book of Ezekiel, right? This idea of this eschatological leader, this person who is going to be leading the children of Israel in some future time. Bar Kokhba takes upon himself this messianic, eschatological name, and we find it on the coins. We find it on the coins, we find it on lead weights, we find it on documents from the Judean desert, which are dated to the outbreak of the revolt. They don't use the term outbreak of the revolt, they use the term Legeulat Yisrael, for the redemption of Israel, or Lecherut Yisrael, for the freedom of Israel. So year 1 to the redemption of Israel, year 2 to the redemption of Israel, and so on and so forth. So these are the terms that we find. This is the dating system used under Bar Kokhba. But again, the term Israel is not used to identify individuals. It's not used to identify communities. Nobody is saying, I am Israel. This is more of an abstract, like I said, biblicized way of thinking about the world. And that's the only way we find the term Israel.
Can I say that it's more used by the elite, by the leadership, to unite people, to promote ideas?
I think by this time, for sure, when we're talking about the coins, the people that are deciding what words should be put on the coins are the elite, right? There's some kind of leadership, the minting authority. You could say the same thing for sure about the lead weights. This was some kind of authority that was in charge of making the weights that put the term on. Presumably Bar Kokhba himself decided on the name, I am Nisi Yisrael. So yes, as far as that's concerned, I would agree. But I think the fact that we have the name on something like coins, which is, it's true, the minting authority is an elite, but it was ordinary people that used the coins. Everyone had at least one coin in their pocket at some point. People used these coins. People were looking at them. They knew what they said, presumably. And so this was something which was meant to speak to ordinary people, and it did. It was ordinary people that were writing documents and dating them to the redemption of Israel, right? So this is something which had certainly by this time filtered down to the ordinary people. And as you asked, that's actually what's important to me. But when ordinary people are using it, it's never in this self-identification. I am an Israelite. It's always in this biblicized kind of language. Okay, so that's the Bar Kokhba period. Moving forward, we again start to find the term Israel on synagogue floors. So, for example, Shalom al Yisrael that we mentioned before appears again on synagogue floors in the southern Levant. Peace upon Israel. We have on tombstones also Shalom al Yisrael, peace upon Israel. It's always in either direct quotes or allusions to biblicized language, again and again and again. And it doesn't appear that often, but the several times that it does appear, it's always in this context. So that one example that I gave from Rome, from that tombstone of that little girl who I identified it as an Israelite, it's still our exception. From the southern Levant as well, we have 0 inscriptions where an individual or a community identify as Israel.
Professor Adler, so what was this pivot moment when all this started. I mean, when people started to associate themselves with Israel as Israelites.
So that is the question, and here we have to speculate a little bit because, as I said, the earliest inscriptional evidence that we have is from this coin from the Great Revolt, which is really quite late. Taking this late appearance and taking the fact that whenever the name Israel does appear from this time and onward, it's always in using biblicized language. I think that a strong hypothesis would be that ordinary Jews started to identify using the name Israel at the same time that they came to know about and adopt as authoritative biblical texts, right? So this notion of Jews as Israel comes from the Bible. It comes from the biblical texts. It didn't precede the biblical texts. It was out of the biblical text. It was out of this idea that the biblical authors came up with and promoted that Jews started to identify or use this term Israel. And I think it would make sense that these two things came together. So then the question is, okay, when did Jews start to know about the biblical texts and regard them as authoritative? So there's a scholar named Reinhard Kratz from the University of Göttingen in Germany, who published in 2013 in German, later in 2015 in English, a book about the biblical Israel and the historical Israel. And he differentiates between the biblical Israel, which is the Israel that we find in the biblical stories, the biblical narratives, and the historical Israel, which is the Israel that we scholars, can discern from the evidence on the ground. And he argues in this book that ordinary Jews didn't come to know about any of the biblical corpus until the Hasmonean period. Right? There's no evidence that before the Hasmonean period, ordinary Jews knew about, any of the biblical stories, anywhere in the biblical corpus, the biblical poetry and wisdom literature, and so on and so forth. He argues that this is something which might have been known amongst a small group of scholars, scribes, but not beyond that. And it was only in the 2nd century, before the Common Era, that ordinary Jews came to know about this biblical corpus. In my book that I published in 2022, I argued that, looking at the archaeological evidence and the textual evidence, that the Torah, the laws of the Torah, the practical laws of the Torah, only came into practice also in the Hasmonean period. There's no evidence before that, no evidence from before the middle of the 2nd century, before the Common Era, that Jews knew about the laws of the Torah or were putting them into practice. So with this in mind, I think a very strong hypothesis can be made that it was also at this time that the identity of Israel was adopted by ordinary Judeans. So like I said, we don't have positive evidence of this until we get into the early Roman period, until the outbreak of the Great Revolt. But I think a very strong case can be made that it would have begun sometime around the Hasmonean period. This is probably the time when Jews started to think biblically. They started to think using biblical terms and terminology, and even if we haven't found archaeological evidence for the name Israel being used in, let's say, synagogue inscriptions, we don't have any from this time. I think that it probably makes sense that this is the beginning. This is where the identity of Israel would have first emerged amongst the ordinary people.
Professor, if this is your conclusion, what would be the implications on the biggest questions of Jewish history, like existence, for example, of united monarchy? One example, or other key issues.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I want to remind you that the evidence that I'm looking at begins with the Babylonian conquest. Before that, we don't have, like I said, we only have really a handful of documents which we can look at, which refer to either Israel or the name Israel, the identity Israel, or the identity of Judah. So what I would say, and I want to be very careful with what I'm saying here, what I would say is this. The evidence that I'm looking at is quite clear, that from the period of the Babylonian conquest and onwards, for the next 1,000 years, the name Israel appears late, and it appears in biblical usage. It's always relating to biblical verses, biblical associations. That means that Judeans, or the descendants of people who lived in the kingdom of Judah, the direct descendants, those that were exiled to Babylonia, identified as Jews. They identified as Judeans, as Jews, and not as Israel. I think that's very, very clear. What does that mean about their ancestors? We can extrapolate, I think, and at least for the period right before the Babylonian exile, and say that probably these same people, certainly the people that were in Babylonia that identified as Jews, probably identified as Jews also when they were still in Judea, in the kingdom of Judah. I think that's a pretty good assumption. Probably their fathers and grandfathers also identified as Jews. Can we extrapolate and say, therefore, there was no united monarchy? It's a bit difficult to make this extrapolation on the basis of this very, very late data. But at the very least, I would say that when we get to the end of the Iron Age, the end of what's often called the First Temple period, I don't like that term, but that's the term that's usually used. People who are living in the southern kingdom identified as Jews, as Judeans, as Judites, and the name Israel would have been a foreign name to them. The name Israel they would have heard of, but they would have associated it with the people that were living in the north. They would have associated it with the people that were exiled by the Assyrians, and quite likely with people who were still living in that area.
And with regard to the kingdom of Israel, we know at least one mentioning of name Israeli by the Assyrians in the story of the Karkar epic battle.
Yeah. Oh, so for sure. The northern kingdom of Israel was they used the name Israel. There's a question of exactly if the house of Omri was the more common term or Israel was the common, but we certainly do have reference to the name Israel on literally a handful of inscriptions. I should mention one later inscription, which I didn't mention, which was found on the island of Delos. Actually, there are two inscriptions, which refer to the Israelites. Okay, this dates to around the 2nd century before the Common Era. And this predates our first revolt coin. But it refers to the Israelites who offer sacrifice on the holy Mount Gerizim. So here we do have reference to Israelites, people who are identifying as Israelites. And that's what we were looking for, people who I am an Israelite. These two inscriptions do refer to such people, but they're not Jews. These are Israelites that offer sacrifice on the holy Mount Gerizim, which means that essentially, who are these people? These are northerners, or people that came from the north to the island of Delos, and these are the people that are identifying as Israelites. So this is actually quite interesting, because there's several hundred years from the last inscription that mentions Israel amongst the Assyrian inscriptions, and this inscription on Delos, which suggests that probably this self-identification as Israel continued amongst people that we would call today the Samaritans, people from the north. It seems, to one degree or another, continued to preserve this name, this identity of Israel from generation to generation. The fact is that it reappears suddenly on Delos. It seems that this identity of Israel was preserved over the generations, but amongst northerners, amongst Samaritans, not amongst Jews.
Up to now, we were speaking about not the literary text. What about literary texts?
So that's an important question, which we can touch on. I don't want to get into too much detail because my study doesn't investigate the literary texts, but we can talk about what the ramifications of this would be for literary texts, which were written throughout this period that we're talking about. From the Babylonian exile, Babylonian conquest until late antiquity. I think it pays, once we've recognized that ordinary Jews, first and foremost identified as Jews, and the term Israel was only used in biblicizing language, once we have that recognition, we have to remember that literary texts were written by authors, literate authors, intelligent, we can call them elites if you'd like, but these were people that were living amongst a much larger population of people, amongst whom their term for self-identification was Jews. Israel was not their primary mode of identification. So now we can start to look at the literary texts and start to ask some interesting questions. So for example, do we find this kind of phenomenon in any literary texts? Do we have literary texts where the only identity that appears, or the primary identity that appears is Jews? And in fact, I can think offhand of one particular biblical work where that is the case, the Scroll of Esther. So in the Scroll of Esther, the Book of Esther, the name Jews appears, I don't remember how many times, dozens of times, right? Mordechai Yehudi, right? The Jews living in the Persian Empire and the Persian provinces, the Jews living in Shushan. The name Israel appears 0 times. What's going on there? Why this is very different from other biblical works. Why in the Scroll of Esther does the name Israel never appear? Interesting. What else doesn't appear in the Scroll of Esther? So the Jewish God doesn't appear. The Torah is not referred to, at least explicitly. So we can start to ask some interesting questions. What's going on with the author of Esther? What point is he trying to get across? Is he trying to does he perhaps know about this name Israel? There are some intertextual allusions to other biblical texts in Esther, so it seems probable that the author of Esther knew about other biblical texts, knew about the Pentateuch, or Pentateuchal texts at least. That seems likely. But then why does he never use the term Israel? Was he trying to perhaps downplay the name? Did he have some kind of ideological impetus for not using the name Israel? Was he trying to suppress the name Israel? It's a possibility which we should consider. Once we recognize that this was actually the case, ordinary people were not using the name Israel, what was going on here? So that's an interesting question. On the other hand, I can think of a whole huge corpus of literary texts where the primary name that Jews are using to identify themselves is Israel. And that's the rabbinic texts. So in the rabbinic corpus, the regular name that the rabbis use when they're referring to Jews is Israel. So for example, a text that we'll talk about, a Jew that bought a field from a Gentile, the term is not Jew. The term will almost never be Jew. The term is always Israel. When an Israelite buys a field from a Gentile, if an Israelite does something, right? This is a term which appears hundreds, if not thousands of times throughout the rabbinic corpus of literature, and we're talking about a really huge corpus of literature. The Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Midrashim, the Talmudim. I would say, I haven't counted, but I'm sure thousands of times the name Israel appears.
In rabbinic literature, it's very important for them to stress the Israel.
Oh, okay. So then the question becomes, what's going on here? Why is this different from what the rabbis would have found once they left the Beit Midrash, once they left the study hall, right? The rabbis would leave the study hall to go to the marketplace, to go home. And once they leave the study hall, the ordinary term that people are using to identify Jews is Jews. Probably that's the language that they used in their ordinary language, the rabbis themselves. So why is it in their literary texts are they using this strange term? And now we can say that this is a strange term. This is not the ordinary term that was being used. What were they up to? What were the rabbis up to when they used the term Israel? And I think, like I think you're trying to suggest here, that the rabbis had a very specific ideological/religious purpose in using the name Israel. They were using biblicized language. They were harking back to this biblical notion of this greater people of Israel. And they were doing something here. And this is something which we can think about more, but it's against the background of what the ordinary people are doing that I think we really need to be thinking about this.
Oh, amazing. But what if we move in time to the Middle Ages or even modern times? How it develops?
The rabbinic literature from antiquity becomes the basis. The early rabbinic literature becomes the basis for medieval rabbinic literature, for early modern rabbinic literature, and modern rabbinic literature. And of course, we have texts of ordinary people throughout the ages. So I just want to put on the table, I haven't studied all of this. I haven't looked at these later periods. This is not my focus in the present study. But from my general knowledge, I can tell you that moving onwards in time, rabbinic literature continues to use the term Israel when referring to Jews. So when I'm thinking about authors like Maimonides and Nachmanides, Rambam and Ramban, and Rashi and the Tosafot and the great rabbinic thinkers of the Middle Ages, they continue to use this early rabbinic terminology of Israel as opposed to Yehudim. It's not that it doesn't appear at all; it's rare. So this identity of Israel continues into the Middle Ages. It continues into the early modern period and the modern period. And I would say that even in our own language, at least I know it's true in Hebrew. I know it's true in English. I know it's true in German, in French. You can tell me about Russian. I believe it's true in Russian as well. Jews don't identify as Israelites or any cognate of Israel. The term is Jew. What's the term in Russian?
Yeah, same.
Yeah. Okay. So
Еврей means.
okay. So this is something which continues actually until today. It's not that we ever stopped using the term Israel. The term Israel was used, has been used, and is used but it's usually in religious terms. When thinking in more ideological terms, it's almost never used in daily language.
Unless you live in Israel in the present days.
Okay, so now, since May 14th, 1948, we have a new identity, which literally appeared, not out of nowhere, we'll talk about this, on May 14th, 1948, when David Ben-Gurion and the Zionist council that formed the State of Israel decided they had to make a decision. What would this Jewish state be called? And there were a couple of options. So Israel was just one of the options. There were some other options. Judea was one option. Zion was another option. There were a few other options I don't recall offhand, but Israel was only one of the options, and it was chosen as the name of the state of Israel. It's not obvious that would be the name that we'd chosen, but it was. And from that point on, from that day onwards, there's this new identity of Israelis, right? So a Yisraeli. And this refers specifically to people who are citizens of this new state of Israel. And if you are a Jew who is not a citizen of the state of Israel, then you are not an Israeli. And if you are a non-Jew who is a citizen of the state of Israel, you are an Israeli. So this is a new kind of identity, very, very new, right? We're talking about 1948. How far back does that go? 77 years. So this is a very new identity. Now, it's not an ex nihilo identity, right? We've been discussing where the name comes from. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Jews, I think from the Hasmonean period, if I'm right, then it would be from the Hasmonean period, have had this identity, have adopted this identity of Israel already from then. So we're going back over 2,000 years. The Jews have had this biblicized identity of Israel. It's this, this ideal, we can call it, identity of Israel. And Jews throughout the ages have had this ideal identity, this ideal name of Israel, which they associated with. On a day-to-day basis, they called themselves and each other Jews, but there was this ideal biblical identity of Israel, which Jews have been associating with for over 2,000 years. It's not surprising that David Ben-Gurion chose Israel as the name for the Jewish state. It's not foreign to the Jews. It is absolutely deeply embedded in the Jewish DNA. So there's nothing surprising about the adoption of the name Israel for the Jewish state. It's quite natural, but we do have to pay careful attention to the fact that that today the name Israeli, it has a slightly different meaning than Yisrael did, throughout the ages. Because, like I said again, an Israeli today can be Jewish, can be not Jewish, as long as you're a citizen of the state of Israel. And if you are Jewish and you're not a citizen of the state of Israel, then you're not an Israeli. So it has its own unique and very modern meaning to it, but it's not completely divorced from the historical notion of Israel, which, like I said, has been associated with Jews since the time of the Hasmoneans.
Well, Professor Jonathan Adler, every meeting with you is fascinating, and I learn a lot, and I'm sure our viewers also learning a lot of new things and new approaches to what we think we know. And I think it's our fourth meeting, and I'm looking forward for additional meetings. And thank you so much on behalf of myself, on behalf of the viewers of Kedem channel. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Alex.
We have opened recently Patreon page, and we would like you to take one moment, go there and to show us your support and help us to create more content which is based on latest academic research. And you know that we are doing our best to find the best lectures going to the academic institutions in Israel and abroad. And all this requires efforts and of course requires resources. And only with your help when we can keep this work going. And thank you again, and thank you to the professor. Yeah. Professor, actually, what I wanted to ask, but I didn't want to interrupt the storyline of our conversation, actually the identity itself. Today we are speaking like we are in the modern times, and we are part of the modern national states, and there are modern nations. So for them, it's for us, for all of us, today it's very clear there is a nation, and but back then, if we go to the ancient Israel, they were sometimes identifying themselves by the place they're living in, more than they identify more than they identify themselves by the just the big names of Jews, Israelites. You know, what do you think? What was this connection between these two?
Okay, so if we're going back, you're talking about the Iron Age, let's say.
Let's say Aaron.
Okay, so in the Iron Age, I think what you would have is if you were living in the north, the Northern Kingdom, you probably, so first of all, amongst your family and friends, it probably didn't come up so much. What's the name of our kingdom? Right? That probably isn't something which came up very often. But if it did, let's say if you were to be traveling or something, and people were to ask you, "Where are you from?" So the name Israel probably did come up. You might mention, who your king was, but the name Israel was probably associated with your ethnic group. Let's say if you were from the Northern Kingdom. If you were from the Southern Kingdom, the same answer, but instead of Israel, it would have been Judah. So, probably it would have come up that you were a Judahite. So that was probably the situation in the Iron Age.
So they would say more or less like I would say now, I am Alex, I am, for example, from Tel Aviv, and I am living in Israel.
Right. Something along those lines. Again, we have to remember that modern day nation states are modern, right? It's a modern concept. So the idea that, you have a passport and you pay taxes to the state of Israel and so on and so forth, this is a modern concept. But as far as an ethnic identity group, that did exist. And yeah, like I said, if you were in the north, you would have been in Israel. And if you were in the south, you would have been Yehuda.
In the ancient times, the borders were frequently changed.
Borders move all the time.
Moved all the time. For example, between Israel and Aram Damascus, the border changed all the time. And even if you see the core region where Israel was born, the highland where actually we are sitting now in Ariel, and other regions like Tel Rehov, they're not the same people, more, but how they manage to understand to whom they belong.
To keep
Right. So there's so there's always going to be border regions, and there's always going to be areas that are in question. Was this an area that was part of the kingdom of Israel? Were the people living here identifying as Israel? We can ask these questions along the borders, but the core existed. Right. So there was a core. We can ask when the identity of Israel first appears, which is an interesting question of itself. I want to stress this is not part of my study. This is something that people have been looking at for generations of scholarship. People have been looking at. We didn't mention the name that I'm sure people are going to be asking about, the Merneptah stele from Egypt. So this is from the late 13th century BCE, around 1200. The first mention that we have, the first clear, let's say, mention of Israel. And there, I say it's a clear mention. It's not so clear what we're talking about. It seems to be a people group of some sort. And it's not clear where this people group is located. It could well be that we're talking about some kind of people group of some sort, a clan, a tribe, something which might be located in the area where the kingdom of Israel later arises. So in the northern highlands area, perhaps. It certainly could be the case in the Merneptah stele. And in that case, we would have some kind of group that's identifying as Israel. Now, there were probably other groups that later were absorbed into the kingdom of Israel that didn't go by the name Israel. But Israel was the name which the kingdom took upon itself for whatever reason. Perhaps this was the largest group, the most important group. Perhaps the first king of the kingdom of Israel came from this group. And then other groups, which might have been smaller or less important, were kind of absorbed into this. This is all speculation, of course. We don't know about this. But what's important for our purposes is that there's no reason to think that people living in the southern Central Highlands would have used the name Israel. So, before, let's say, we have the name Judah appearing, the earliest use of the name Judah is from the 8th century, late 8th century BCE. Before that, it could have been used. So we could have had, whatever groups were living in the southern Central Highlands in the earlier periods of the Iron Age may well have used the term Judah. We just don't have any evidence for it. But what we certainly don't have evidence for is that the name Israel would have been used in the southern area.
That goes against the united monarchy.
So we don't have, I would say, we don't have good evidence for this for a united monarchy.